Welcome to video 27. So this is another video where we are looking at strings, this one focusing on string slicing. So the purpose of this video is for you to understand the syntax of string slicing and to be able to apply this to your Python programs. Just a reminder then guys that in the monster folder on Schoology you will find these videos and the Python monster booklets. Also in the folder are two PDF documents that catalogue the videos. Now the playlist and booklet PDF shows the videos in playlist order with the relevant booklet or booklets that supplement the playlist for that particular topic. The other document is the full catalogue PDF, and that orders the videos in sequence with a copy of the timestamps from the video's YouTube page. Now in terms of this particular video guys, just to point out that the string handling or string manipulation as it's sometimes called is the programming topic on your course, with the greatest difference between Python syntax and ERL syntax, especially when it comes to substrings. And substrings are the traditional term for what Python calls slicing. So with regard to substrings versus Python slicing, there's a pretty big difference. Now you can find a direct comparison between all of the ERL syntax and the Python syntax in the lookup guide, which you'll see at the bottom right hand corner of the slide, which is in the Python monster resource folder as well. Okay, so with all of that in mind guys, let's crack on and do some demos. Slicing is the Python name for creating substrings from larger strings. We can also apply slicing to Python lists to create sublists or smaller lists as well. Sometimes we say that we are extracting a substring from larger strings, but it's always the case that creating substrings does not alter the original string. So the original string stays as is. So it's a little bit like we're saying, let's take a copy of just part of a string, the part that we need for whatever reason. So before we start creating substrings using slicing in Python, I think it's helpful to do a comparison with the Python for loop, or more specifically the way that we use the range and the parameters that go in the brackets to define what the iteration looks like. Now some of you will be familiar with this already if you've viewed the videos on lists, for example, in which case you may want to skip this part of the video or to carry on watching it for your revision if you want to do that as well. So I'm not sure guys if you've come across the term parameter yet in the classroom, but typically in Python and indeed in other programming languages as well, if you've got a set of brackets and there's values that go in the brackets, we tend to refer to those values as parameters. So you will know from your experience using iteration and Python for loops that in the range brackets we can put up to 3 values. So the first value you will know is what we call the start value, and that defines the index at which the iteration starts. So in this case it's a simple counting loop, so we're going to start with the integer 0. The second parameter that goes in the brackets is what we call the stop value. So in Python we would say that in this case we are iterating from 0 up to but not including 3, and you can see confirmation of that on the right hand side of the screen where it says 0, 1 and 2. So this particular loop has iterated 3 times and it's printed out 0, 1 and 2. And the last parameter in the brackets specifies the pattern for iteration. So in other words, we may want to include every single iteration, in which case that's steps of 1, and that's the example that we've used in this case, or we may want to include only every other iteration as our pattern of iteration, in which case we would put steps of 2 in there. Okay, and we can of course put other values in for that parameter as well. So 0, 3 and 1 creates the output you can see on the screen, which is 0, 1 and 2. So let me just get rid of those boxes, and the reason I'm doing this is to make the point that actually the syntax for slicing is very similar. So if you remember one syntax, then the chances are that you'll remember both of them. So let's do a simple example by assigning a string to a variable and then creating a substring from our original string. So there we go then. So we've assigned Sunday to the variable word. So let's imagine that I want a substring which includes the characters sun. So what would the thinking and the logic be, do you think guys, if it's very similar to a Python for loop? So I would say that we want the substring that starts with the character at position or index 0, goes up to but not including the character D, which is at position 3, and then we want to include all of the characters in between. So we need somehow to specify 0, 3 and 1, just as we've done with the Python for loop. So let's do that. Let's put in a bit of common sense and say we want it to be exactly the same. Okay, because the logic and the thinking is the same. So if I run that, unfortunately, I will get a syntax error. And when it says on here, string object is not callable, that's Python's way of saying, I sort of get the bit in between the brackets, but the syntax is wrong. So what we need to do is we need to swap the curved brackets for square brackets. So let's do that now. Okay, so we swap out the curved for the squares, and then we swap the commas for colons. Okay, so let's run that now and see if we get something acceptable by Python. Okay, so we get exit code 0, which means it's happy with that. So we just need to print out word to see what we actually get. So let's print word. Okay, so let's run that again and see if we get sun. And we do indeed get sun. Okay, so what I could equally do, of course, is I could use variable assignment. So what I could do is I could keep word the same. All right, so that's my original string. And then let's create a new variable called substring. Okay, there we go, substring. And that becomes word, same syntax on the end. Okay, so we want 0, 3, and then 1. And we, of course, need to print that out. So let's print out substring. And let's make sure that we get sun as well as the value assigned to substring. And we do indeed, guys. So two examples of the same thing. One where I've used a literal, and the other where I have been working with variables so that we can store both the original string and the new substring. So as you know, guys, Python with the for loop will work with default values. So for example, the default value for the start position, if I just get my little drawing tool up, the default position for the start position in a for loop is 0. So if we're working with 0 anyway, we can take that parameter out of the brackets, and the default for iteration is 1. So we could take that out of the brackets as well. Question then is, can I do something similar with slicing? Can we work with similar default values? So let's give it a go and see what happens. Let's start off with iteration. So what I can do then, if I want to iterate in steps of 1, is I can just remove that as the Python default. Okay, so then it's 0 to 3. Can I do the same thing with our slicing? Can I treat 1 as a default value and remove that so we just have 0, 3? So let's run it and see if we get any problems. And that works fine too. So in other words, with slicing, we can work with the same default for iteration, and with slicing, that's the same default as including all characters between our stop position and our start position. So let's apply the same thinking with the start value. The default start value in a for loop is 0. So of course, in this example, I can take that out and I can just leave the 3 in the bracket. Question, can I do the same thing with slicing? So can I take the 0 out? So guys, have a look at this before I run it and have a think about what this is going to produce here. Let's have a look and see what we get. Okay, so with the for loop, I get exactly the same thing, but I've got something slightly different with the slicing. And why is that, guys, do you think? Well, what we've actually done is we've reduced our syntax down to where we're actually saying to Python, can you give me the distinct or the unique value that's stored at index position 3? And that's not the same thing. So if we want to include defaults, but we want just to work with the range for an extract, okay, or for slicing, we need to include a colon before the 3. So the only difference between the two syntax now is that with the for loop, we just include, okay, the stop value, but with our slicing, we need to include a colon before the stop value. Oh, and of course I need to run that, don't I, just to make sure that it works. Okay, so let's do that. Make sure that we get sun. Oops. And we do get sun, so that's fine. So guys, for this demo, we're going to look at reverse iteration. So in the case of a simple counting loop, that would be counting downwards. So let's do an example of a simple for loop where, let's say we count from 10 down to 4. So how would I do that in a for loop? Where we would do count, for count in range, and then we want to start at 10. We want to go down to, but not including 3. In other words, we stop at 4, which is what we want. And then we always need to remember that when we're doing a countdown or we're doing reverse iteration, then the steps needs to be negated. Okay, so in other words, we are iterating in steps of -1 in this case. And then of course, all we need to do is to print out count. So let's print count. Okay, make sure that runs okay. That's a bit slow, isn't it? Gosh. Okay, so there we get on screen, guys. What we were expecting: 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and 4. Okay, so the question then is, can we do something similar in slicing? Can we create a string in reverse? Okay, but as a substring. So let's have a go then. We'll do exactly the same type of thing as we've done with the counting loop. So let's say word equals, we're going to need a slightly longer word than we had last time. So let's choose, on a similar theme, let's choose days of the week. Okay. And what we want to say is a substring. All right, so substring becomes, and we're going to follow exactly the same syntax as we did with the for loop. So we're going to say square brackets, and then we want 10 colon, okay, and then 3 and -1. What you might want to do, guys, actually is to pause the video and see if you can work out what we are going to get as a result of the reverse substring, if you like, or a reverse slice. I can get a little bit confusing, so if you want to pause the video and see what you get, and apply some thinking to that, that would be quite cool. Okay, so let's print out substring and see what we actually get. So let's do print of substring, and we get E, W, E, H, T, F, and O. Does that make sense, guys? That's the question. So let's go through this step by step. It can get a bit confusing, and the thing to remember here is that the string that we get, because we've specified the -1, is going to be the string in reverse. Okay, so let's go through this. We're saying let's start at 10. Okay, so bearing in mind that we're starting at the end of the word and working backwards, which is the same type of thinking with a countdown, we're starting at the end of days of the week. Okay, so we start off at K, and then we're actually saying don't start thinking about this, Python, until you get to character at position 10. So the character at position 10, if we count this, this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so we start doing our processing. Okay, if we start at the end of the string and working back, then we start the processing, okay, at the second character in week, okay, which is the E, and that's what we get here. Okay, so that works. Okay, so that's the first point, working backwards from the end of the string to the beginning of the string, where we start doing our processing. So we process, okay, starting at the character at position 10. Okay, then we say to Python, keep going backwards in the string until you get down to, but not including, the character at position 3. In other words, it's going to stop at the character that's in index position 4. So the character in position 4 is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's the O of the word of. Okay, so now that Python has worked out the start position, which is here, and the stop position, which is there, it's now going to print out those characters in reverse. Okay, so what we should get is E, W, E, T, H, F, and O. And if we look here, guys, that's exactly what we get. Okay, all right, E, W, E, H, T, F, O. So as I said, it can be a little bit confusing, but that's because we're asking Python to print whatever substring it gets backwards. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. In the next demo, I'm going to include some very specific and quite infamous, quite infamous syntax involved with slicing, guys. Okay, and then I also want to make a comparison with the OCR's exam reference language as well. So let's move on to the next demo. So in the previous demo, we looked at doing a countdown or reverse iteration, and I'm going to stick with that theme for the moment. So question guys, if I wanted to do a countdown from 10 to 0 inclusive, how would I change the parameters in my bracket for the for loop? Well, 10 stays the same, obviously, because that's our starting value. We are iterating in reverse, so -1 stays the same. We just need to change this to -1. So let's print that and make sure, or run that, make sure we get the right output, which indeed we do. So 10 down to 0 inclusive. So with this thinking then of being able to specify -1 in order specifically to cater for and include 0, I should be able to use exactly the same thinking if I wanted a substring, which is essentially this string but with all of the characters in reverse. Because if you think about it, the starting index for the letter D is at 0. So if logically thinking, if I wanted Python to create a substring of all of these characters in reverse, it needs to start off with the highest index and then go down to, but not including, the character at -1, because that's the only way we would get it, again applying the same logic and thinking, to include the D, which is at position or index 0 in our string. So let's do this then and see what we get. The first thing I'm going to do then actually is to create a constant, which is the length of our string. Okay, so using the usual format for a constant, guys, is capital letters. So len becomes, and then we just want length of word. Okay, so in here I need len -1, okay, because the highest index is the length of the string -1. So len -1. Okay, and then in order to go down to but include 0, I should need to put -1 in here. Okay, so let's run that and see if we get our expected output. So the iteration works fine, and then certainly it's the case in PyCharm that Python just decides to do nothing whatsoever. So it doesn't print anything. And the question, guys, is why? Because logically that should work fine. So let's see if we can get Python to do at least something. Let's go down to but not include 0 with that iteration, and let's do something similar with our reverse string. Let's print that and see if we get something. Well, Python's woken up at least, so we get 10 down to 1 inclusive of 1, which is what we would expect, and this is the string or substring that Python has produced for us, and it's starting at k, okay, which is what we would expect here at the back end of the string, and it's stopped after it's done the count for a. Okay, so it's gone down to index value of 1, which is what we would expect, but obviously no further, guys, okay, because we've specified 0 here, so it doesn't go down to 0, it stops at the character of at the position of 1. So the question is, this is all rather quirky, isn't it? Okay, why does Python not want to produce the entire string in reverse? Let's just get rid of those boxes. And the reason, guys, is because with a string we are given a specific range of values for the string, which starts at 0, so character D is at 0, okay, and then the character of k represents the highest index value of our string. Anything outside that is out of range. So Python won't let us go down to -1 index of the string, because -1 doesn't actually exist. So in order to cater for this quirky little thing that we have with Python, we have a specific format, or a specific syntax, if you like, which allows us to do exactly this, okay, to create a substring of the original string, but with all of the characters in reverse. And the way that we do that is we get rid of almost everything apart from 2 colons and a -1. All right, and you will see this syntax in texts and on the internet that are addressing the topic of string handling and string manipulation. You will see this format used a lot, because it's the only format that allows us to do exactly what we're trying to do, which is to create an entire string but with all of the characters in reverse. So let's just run that and make sure it does actually work okay. Okay, so this time you can see that with our word we do indeed start off at k, which is what we expect, and the last character that's included is in actual fact the very first character at index 0. Okay, so we have k to d inclusive and everything in between, so that works fine as well, guys. So this demo is all about presenting to you a format that you will see a lot in textbooks on the internet, and understanding exactly what on earth is going on with this peculiar : :1. So what I wanted to do in this demo is to look specifically at OCR's exam reference language and the examples that they use for the syntax to do with string handling or string manipulation. And we're going to look at slicing in particular. So if you have a look at the screen now, this is the extract, and I've put some boxes around there to direct your attention to the examples. So the example that's used in the extract is to take a variable called subject and to assign it the value of computer science, the string. Okay, so that's our main string from which we are going to create substrings. And the syntax that ERL uses is subject.substring and then open bracket 3,5, and that gives us pewter. Now, to be fair to OCR, this is exactly the type of syntax and logic that most other programming languages use. It's just that Python does things differently. Okay, where does the 3 and 5 come from? Well, the logic here is that you start off at index 3, so the character at index 3 is P in computer science, and then you want a string which is 5 characters long. So starting at P, a string which is 5 characters long is pewter, P-U-T-E-R. So it's a very simple, actually, and it's a very logical syntax that most other languages continue to adopt. Okay, so if we go back to our PyCharm screen, how do we create that with Python slicing? Well, let's put in subject. Now let's do a straight print, actually. So let's print subject. Okay, and let's print the substring of subject will be 3. So the starting index is the same, but in Python slicing, okay, our second parameter there needs to be 8. So let's just make sure that that does actually give us 8. Okay, and we do indeed get pewter. So because the reason it's different, guys, is because the thinking in Python is only to include index values. Okay, so rather than including a string of a certain length as our substring, Python uses the 8 to identify the point that we need to go up to but not include. Okay, so index value of 8 is actually the capital letter S. Okay, so up to but not including S means that we start at index 3, okay, and we go up to and include the R of computer. So that gives us the same substring, okay, which is P-U-T-E-R. Okay, just a different way of thinking and a slightly different syntax as well. And interestingly enough, you will notice that the ERL example uses the dot function format that I've mentioned in other videos as well, okay, which strictly speaking we call a method. So what the ERL doing is ERL is doing is to employ a method, subject.substring. Now, in addition to that, if I put the extract up again, you will notice that ERL includes this bizarre thing, which is a function called left and right. And in fact, again, most other programming languages provide this as a very convenient way of simply plucking out a substring, either starting at the left-hand side or starting at the right-hand side. So you can see an example of .left. It says subject.left 4 returns comp, and that's simply saying from the left hand side of the string, okay, get me the first 4 characters of the string. Likewise, .right means start off at the right hand side of the string and okay, and just read me the 3 characters, okay, at the right hand side of the string. So computer science, guys, the last 3 characters are essentially NCE. Okay, so that sort of makes perfect sense. The question is, what does Python slicing look like as the equivalent of left and right? Because Python doesn't include the left and the right functions that you get in other languages, or certainly a syntax which is very, very similar. So on the PyCharm screen, guys, I've just included the ERL examples, okay, in block comments. So ERL example subject.left 4 gives comp, and likewise subject.right 3 gives NCE. You have to admit, guys, actually, that it's a really nice, simple and very convenient syntax offered by ERL and other languages as well. But of course, the Python syntax doesn't really accommodate this because we don't have named functions when we are applying slicing. Okay, it's all done within those square brackets. So do we have equivalents? Well, yes, we do. The equivalent of left 4 is to say print subjects, just like we did before. Okay, and then our substring we do :4. Okay, so that's exactly the same, and in fact we saw that in a previous demo. where it would normally have simply been subject 4, but we couldn't do that because that would give us the specific character at index value 4. So we just dropped that colon in at the beginning. So that's the easier one to remember. So let's just run that and make sure it does give us comp, and there you go. Okay, so the Python equivalent, slicing equivalent of subject.left4 is :4. Okay, now the equivalent of going to the right hand side of the string and plucking out the 3 characters at the back end is to actually put the number. Okay, I'll just make this bigger, guys. Actually, what you do, guys, is you take the number and you pop it on the other side of the colon and you apply a negative. Okay, so -3 : let's just run that and make sure it does indeed run, and I'm not telling you porkies. So there you get NCE, guys. Okay, so there are some little rules of the nice little trick of the trade that you can use slicing to achieve the same thing, but you need to remember these little rules, guys. Okay, so when you have left and right, the first thing to remember is to pop a colon in the middle. Okay, if it's a left ERL requirement, okay, then the number you want 4 goes on the right hand side, so it's the opposite, guys. Okay, so the left requirement or the left function means in slicing you put the number on the right hand side of the colon. Okay, and that does exactly the same thing. Now when it's a right hand side specification or a right hand side function, okay, you put the number on the left hand side. Okay, but you need to remember to include a minus, okay, because in essence it's the equivalent of well, it's not really reverse iteration, okay, but it's the equivalent of telling Python that you're working at the other end of the string. Okay, so you just need to remember to put not only the number on the left hand side for a right function, but to include the minus as well. Okay, if you don't include the minus, guys, you get the rest of the word, okay, not the NCE. You can try that out for yourselves if you like. Okay, so hopefully that's helped, guys. I just wanted you to make you aware of the fact that if you are interested in making use of the ERL syntax, then there is a Python equivalent of that as well. Okay, guys, so that brings me to the end of this demo, but also the end of the video as well. In the next video, I want to be looking at string functions in Python, which allow us to do some basic input validation, some data validation, which we haven't been doing in previous videos, but it's very, very useful. Okay, guys, see you in the next video.